The doctor and accompanying guards all froze as they entered Nia's medical room, and found the chaos contained therein. Seeing that the entire interior decor had been turned on its head, the guards quickly reacted by swiftly pulling the doctor back out the door while they themselves lifted their weapons and scanned around the room. Even though they obviously knew who and what they were looking for here, it seemed for a moment that they were very used to searching for much taller targets than their current one, and therefore it took them a couple of seconds of looking entirely too high up before their blue eyes finally got the all-important idea to look down. Seeing James broken free from his shackles and far away from where he was supposed to be, they immediately trained their guns on the dangerous human. However, even with all the hostility and animosity that was deeply instilled within the core welders, it barely took them more than a breath before their combat-ready stances shook themselves up at the sight of the man. Observing the primate on the ground, curled and slumped up against the wall with his face hidden under his naked arms, leaving both organic and mechanical limb freely visible after his jacket had been tossed to the side, they didn't quite lower their weapons, but the clear intent behind their aggressive pointing died down as they took the thin tips of their arms off the trigger. Obviously, James only heard and didn't see who had come in. Still, he didn't lack the imagination to figure exactly what was going on next to him. "I'm not going to do anything," he quietly assured the Coivery, as they still stood almost entirely still. "Please, take care of her." With that, he lifted his gaze slowly, though he still didn't look at the weapons trained on him. Instead, he glanced over to where his sister still lied. She was safe. That was what mattered. It took a moment of careful consideration between his captors, but ultimately the armed guards allowed the doctor to walk past them and over to his patient. Quite clearly, the man was still pretty irritated by the fact that the bed and all the equipment attached to Nia had been moved around the room, but he didn't let it bother him too much as he began to run the necessary checks on his comatose patient. As he worked, he occasionally glanced back to her slumped brother, who watched the doctor like a hawk without even noticing it himself. James's mind wasn't entirely present. Admittedly, it was nowhere near as bad as when they had first gotten to this place. However, with the seemingly endless sleep deprivation and his concerning lack of appetite, his energy reserves had slowly but surely begun to dwindle. Humans were enduring. They remained on their feet for a very long time. Unhealthily long if they really wanted to, but even the most tenacious creatures had their limits.
"James?"
A low voice suddenly broke through the ringing in his ears, and the buzzing in his mind as James's eyes widened as his head snapped around to follow it to its source. Needing to look almost straight up in his slumped position, James suddenly found himself face to face with a familiar Perthwasis, whose crossed, multi-irised eyes stared down at him with an air of both hesitation and pity. The Gaza stepped aside, allowing the acting councilman to walk right up to James without any resistance. The old man's crescent-like ear stayed motionlessly erect as he slowly bent his round head downwards, trying to somewhat descend down to James's current level. However, due to his age and general fragility, the elder barely managed more than a slight bow before his back and joints forced him to stop in his attempt. James exhaled deeply, and after a few long seconds of staring up, he broke the eye contact again. "What did I tell you about showing up unannounced?" he mumbled into his own arms, not even managing to summon the energy to sound annoyed at the old fool. He still didn't have much sympathy for Afyuna. Not at all. However, with everything that had so suddenly piled onto him, ever since their last run-in with each other, the indecisive fence-sitter barely registered as an inconvenience anymore.
"I am not here on a public visit,"
Afyuna assured him in reply, and, seeing how James wasn't returning his gaze anymore, slowly stood up straight again.
"Technically, it's not a visit at all. I am simply here on a welfare check."
James's head turned ever so slightly to the side, allowing him to look just over the very edge of his arm, granting him vision of basically just Afyuna's feet in his current position. "Welfare check?" he questioned in a skeptical tone. However, Afyuna did not seem to be disheartened by James's skepticism at all.
"Indeed,"
the old man replied, keeping his voice soft and calm as he spoke slowly and with clear intent.
I wanted to personally make sure you were being treated well. What happened to and around you was nothing short of a tragedy. You do not deserve being treated like a criminal for it, and certainly not anything worse."
After he said that, he hesitated for a moment, and his body turned ever so slightly, indicating he was probably glancing behind himself. Then, in a whisper that was probably not quite enough to actually not be heard by everyone in the room, Athena hesitantly added,
"Your current condition, is that—"
"I just didn't sleep a lot," James reflexively interrupted the man, in a defensive outburst that had happened quicker than he could stop it. His voice was snappy and aggressive, and reflected all the agitation that he felt from the unnecessarily stressful night that he had. It was very frustrating, feeling this trapped and helpless, despite the fact that he technically wasn't treated all that badly. So far, there was nothing there that really indicated any threat to his well-being, and yet despite that fact, he basically had to be ready for something to happen, just in case that it would. It was extremely grating. Still, despite having never made a secret of his dislike of Athena during their conversations, even James felt that the old man didn't quite deserve such a harsh treatment in this case here, assuming his motives were genuine. Taking a deep breath, he recentered himself and spoke up again, now with a much more controlled tone to it. "I've been worried about the possibility of another attack," he admitted, without needing to be prompted to do so. "If the hotel was hacked, there is nothing saying that this place can't be as well. And even if that wasn't the case, there's—" He lifted his head slightly, interrupting himself as his mouth was simply kept talking without his brain even quite knowing where the sentence was going. However, now that it had formed in his mind, a certain thought suddenly pushed itself right into the foreground as he stared down at his mechanical arm. Instinctively, he closed his fist and flexed the artificial muscles to keep his reaction down. "One of the people who did this to me was a Quavery." James finally gave voice to the thought that had so far not consciously occurred to him, but that had in hindsight probably been there in the background this entire time, even if he wouldn't have been able to put his finger on it before right now. His eyes remained affixed to the prosthetic as he talked. It was likely he didn't really need to tell anyone, as his retellings of his side of the events on Ostnerjar were quite well known basically everywhere. Still, the thought simply demanded to be made real by giving it sound. "I know it's dumb and unfair, but I guess I just find it hard to put my full trust in them. Especially now." It kind of stung having to admit his own bias like that, especially after he hadn't really been aware of it up until now. But right now, even if he had wanted to act tough, he was simply too tired to play pretend like everything was fine.
"I can't say I can exactly blame you for that,"
Athena replied after a moment of thought. Then he immediately fell quiet again, seeming to drift into a much deeper pondering as he looked down at the human that was probably barely recognizable to him after he had met James basically only at his most energetic so far. However, he finally spoke up again after having thought for a minute at least.
"Say, can I ask you an earnest question? I promise you, I mean no offense by it."
James exhaled slowly. "People usually say that before asking something offensive," he stated. He had meant for it to sound humorous. However, his voice had come out so flat that any attempt at jesting was entirely lost in delivery. "But sure, go ahead." Athena hesitated for another moment, but then he apparently made up his mind about committing to it.
"Forgive me if it sounds a bit strange to you, but would you say that you replaced your arm?"
He finally got his question out. Despite already sitting slumped, James froze up at the question as his mind needed a moment to process it. He was, in fact, not offended by it. However, it took him a bit to really try to figure out what the old man probably meant by it. He released a questioning sound as he stared down into the darkness of his own making, as his arms blocked out the light for him. "Only because I don't really have a better word for it," he then finally responded, feeling his prosthesis inadvertently move in a slight wave against his head. "Is not as much a replacement as it is something new that took the place of my arm. I know you could also call that a replacement as well, but I don't think it is in the way you probably mean it."
I think I understand what you mean,
Athena assured James, and by the way his voice was wobbling as he spoke, James could tell that he was nodding. Why did you ask? James then questioned the man, and truly lifted his head for the first time since the conversation had really begun, as curiosity overcame his gloom for a moment.
I was just wondering,
Athena replied, in a tone that implied a shrug. That genuinely gave James pause. It was rare that people were just wondering about things like cybernetics, especially people like Athena. Seen as the human was now really looking at him, Athena made an inviting movement with his arm, beckoning James to get up. James had no idea what he was planning. However, for some reason, his legs had reacted before his brain had made up his mind, and he quickly found himself standing before the much larger man. And then, as the old man turned and left the room, James wordlessly followed. As he did, James for the first time felt a sliver of what other people apparently experienced when they looked to the living legend. So far, James could only ever see him as a people-pleaser, with all the backbone of a cardboard cutout. However, just at that moment there was a certain air about him that James couldn't really describe.
Your people have brought the matter of your custody all the way up to the acting council,
Athena explained after a couple of steps. Although it would have likely been their duty in this kind of situation, it seemed like the guards weren't even thinking about stopping him and the human. It didn't exactly instill confidence that they bent to perceived authority so readily. However, just in this specific case, James wouldn't complain.
I made it a priority to discuss the matter quickly, much to the chagrin of some of my fellows. However, a majority agree that, under the condition that you will not be set free immediately, your temporary custody should probably be handled by those who are best equipped for it. And after seeing the scene I arrived to today, I don't think the Coiverie will be able to raise a reasonable objection to that.
The old man chuckled very softly at his own statement, while James glanced down at his arm once again. It was only now that he really realized that his now useless shackles were still dangling off his organic arm, secure by their unbroken half. I didn't try to escape, he tried to assure the councilman. However, the statement only made Athena chuckle more.
No, you didn't,
the old man confirmed for him, and glanced back over his shoulder as he walked on undisturbed.
You managed to escape, and then you simply decided to stay put.
He then breathed deeply in and out while turning his gaze forwards again.
You know, much like my own people, the Coiverie were there when the galactic community was first founded. Or it would be more precise to say that they were already there when its predecessor was, he explained. They are an incredibly old species and have single-handedly garnered an incredible respect for their entire order, much like the Cimmeriskis once sowed the seed that led to you primates being as revered as you are today. When standing before the choice, not few people are going to side with them based on their reputation alone.
After saying that, he stopped for a moment. Not just his speaking either. He physically stopped in the middle of walking, causing James to nearly crash into him, as he had not managed to pivot around the man's massive body at the very last second before stopping as well. Confusedly, he looked up at Athena, who had now closed his eyes.
But I don't believe anyone thinks they are infallible.
The Pepphrases finally finished his sentence. Then he opened his eyes back up to look at James.
And although you are a Deathworlder, and although you are a cyborg, I don't believe anyone thinks that you are somehow ever erring.
Although the choice of word was a bit strange, it seemed that the old man truly could not think of a better way to describe what exactly he was thinking and feeling.
I have to believe that, he continued,
with a voice that sounded quite determined on the surface, but was quietly underlined with a hint of desperation.
I have to believe in this galaxy I have served for so long.
James didn't quite know how to respond to that. It wasn't like he didn't have anything to say on the matter. The back of his mind was coming up with a number of choice words to retort what the man was saying. However, his mouth didn't want to speak any of them as he looked up at the man's firm face, that was quite obviously shaken just underneath the surface. With the muscles just under his hollow cheeks swelling as he visibly grit his teeth, Athena then turned to keep walking without another word, leaving James to hesitantly follow after him yet again. Only now, The human finally glanced around, realizing a bit too late that he had no idea where the old man had even led him at this point. Where are we going? His mind finally formulated the all-important question that he should have probably asked before even taking the first step after the man. Afiona released a huff through his thin, gill-like nostrils as his gait got a bit stiffer.
"I told you, I am here on a welfare check,"
was all that he replied in a deep, toneless voice, leaving James to question what exactly his motivations were here. As they made it around one more corner, James's eyes fell onto a lone Qoivery who stood in front of a door that looked just like any other in this place. A black and blue identifier dangling around their neck identified them as one of the guards, although unlike many of their colleagues, they appeared to not be armed as they nervously stepped in place and glanced around constantly. That was until they finally noticed the two people approaching them. "Sir, what did you do to his cuffs?" the ivory tree-like person asked, with the pale dots in their eyes widening, as they realized James was walking with just half a shackle behind the councilman. However, Afiona lifted his short-clawed hand to wave their concerns away.
"He was like this when I got here,"
the old man said truthfully, in a hasty and disgruntled voice as he quickly stepped up to his fellow core-welder.
"Now open the door."
The Qoivery swallowed audibly, and seemed to not quite be able to decide which of the two unlikely paired figures they wanted to focus on here, as their face kept snapping back and forth between Afiona and James. "Are you sure this is a good idea, sir?" they asked carefully, finally settling on looking at Afiona with a pleading look that was basically begging him to reconsider. However, their begging fell onto deaf ears.
"I told you it is important."
Afiona pressed the poor guard, making full use of his enormous authority as his entire demeanor turned insistent. James blinked a couple of times as the Qoivery swallowed again and took one last gaze down at him before turning to comply with Afiona's demands, moving to open the door for the both of them. James looked to the portal suspiciously, wondering just what was waiting behind it. He was sure that this was not one of the rooms his friends were being detained in, and yet Afiona said he was here for a welfare check. That could basically only mean... This is highly forbidden, James thought aloud, as the realization finally hit him, and he instinctively took a step back away from the door. Not because he was afraid of what was inside or breaking the rules. Not really. Mostly, he was afraid of how he himself might react if what he thought was behind that door truly waited for him, inside of that room.
"A formality at this point,"
Afiona replied, very apparently barely recognizing James's words as a problem.
"I have little doubt that the moment your alliance takes over custody, they will immediately allow you to question them anyway."
That, at the same time, completely confirmed what James was thinking, while also being factually entirely wrong. There was, most likely, no way in hell that James would even be allowed anywhere near the general proximity of these people. Which was also what gave him tremendous pause. He knew he shouldn't. He knew he really shouldn't. He knew that to any reasonable person it was entirely clear that he was by no means allowed to go in there, and it probably wasn't a good idea at all. Only a total idiot would honestly think that it was okay for him to follow Afiona into that room. And yet, he had never been outright forbidden to go in there. Nobody had ever explicitly told him that this room was off limits, and none of the guards had stopped him on his way here. In fact, one had just personally opened the door for him. It was a complete set of mental gymnastics, making multiple twirls and sticking the landing by the end. But, speaking entirely legally, there was technically no really good argument against it. If the door was opened for him by one of his guards, then he was surely allowed to go inside. If he didn't act now, it was unlikely that he would ever get the chance to get the answers he personally wanted within any reasonable time frame. Sure, the Admiral had assured him that these people would be questioned for all the information they were worth, but that would be Reason's job, and he would be lucky if he even got to see the full interrogation afterwards, instead of just a brief summary of the most important information. And even if he did, the questions asked would quite probably not include some of the ones that were burning on his mind. This is an amazingly stupid idea, James quietly thought to himself, as he slowly followed Athena, stepping into the room with feet that felt like they were sticking to the ground with each step. Before he truly passed the threshold of the door, his organic hand snapped over to his mechanical arm, grabbing onto it right on the link between two of its segments in a vice-like grip that would hopefully help him focus and fight against any immediate reactions he would have to the people inside. As he truly walked inside, he closed his eyes. He took a deep breath in, he held, and he breathed out. In control, he told himself. Based on some noises that were outrage to say the least, accompanied by the very familiar clinking of a chain that was pulled taut, James already knew just where the occupants of this room were positioned in relation to him, and thus it didn't take his eyes any searching to find their faces as he slowly opened them. There was an immediate push in the back of his mind as the view of the feline sunk in. He had only seen glimpses of them during the attempt at his life, yet they immediately came flashing back to him as he looked right at their face, and those glimpses weren't the only place he knew them from. During the ambush back on Dunama, when a desperate Kafwem had given the order to detain James and his party, these two had been there. The one sitting on the side of the bed, chained to it just like James had been to Nia's, was a man with a dark, gruff face that sported a scar from a deep cut just above his cheekbone. He had been one of the soldiers trying to hold onto Andres during the attempted arrest, and his efforts had been met with a sharp blade down the line. The man stared back at James with an expression that spoke of pure hatred, as his eyes narrowed into pinpricks while his hair and hackles raised along with his ears. His tail swayed in an aggressive restlessness, and a glance at his hands showed that his claws were extended far out. However, his face wasn't exactly the one that had given James his reaction, because the other one, that of the man who actually needed the bed, was imprinted far clearer into his mind. It had burned itself into his inner eye during a moment of unbridled emotion, as this very man had been the one with blood in his hand, after the deep gashes that still marked Sheeta's face today had been torn into her skin. Their recent conflict hadn't been the first time James had felt burning rage at this man, and for a second, he nearly threatened to drift back into this very same mindset again. However, one thing that stopped him was that this man, unlike Nia, was awake and aware, despite his injuries. And as he slowly turned his head over to look at the people so suddenly arriving to his room, his movements were filled with spasms and uncontrolled twitches of his muscles, causing his motion to look like that of an improperly programmed robot that needed to adjust for its new position after every millimeter that it moved. Given that the man had been fit and active back during the ambush on Dunama, it was clear that something must have happened in the time since then that caused his current condition. Had it been whatever hit had landed on the feline during their gunfight? James doubted it. It was unlikely that a bullet would cause such lasting damage, without at least putting the man out of commission for a good while, before he was this aware again. Luckily, his thoughts about what may have happened were just enough to keep him from drifting into any much darker habits of his, even if a huge, barely suppressed part of his certainly wanted to. Following these urges right here, right now, it would have been nothing more than murder, and James knew that. However, that by no means meant that there wasn't a good part of him that didn't care about that fact at all.
"Well, it looks like they are being treated well enough," Athena mumbled, while the healthy one of the two felines pulled on the chain, shackling him even stronger for a moment. However, since he obviously had no chance of breaking free from them, that was the extent of his actions, as he had the awareness to not uselessly throw himself against his restraints in vain attempts to get at James, despite the mutual hatred clearly driving him to do so as well. "Are you here to finish the job?" the feline scornfully spoke up, his already dark expression furrowing even more, now resembling a snarl. He entirely ignored Athena. All of his focus was on James. "I should," James's thoughts told him. However, he managed to not speak them into existence, as his hand tightened around his mechanical arm even stronger. Unlike his interlocutor,
He couldn't quite focus on the man glaring at him, since his own gaze was over and over again drawn to the so much more hated face of the man on the bed. Again, he had to remind himself to breathe. Many people thought it ridiculous, including him once upon a time, but James knew forcing himself to breathe deeply truly helped regain a lot of power over himself. He just had to remind himself to do it. What had once been an automatic response had become strange to him again, and he hadn't even realized it. In and out. In control. Although, even after the exercise, James didn't really feel like he had the capacity for any niceties, or even the pretense of decorum. "I want to know why you did it." It bubbled out of him without any context or formality attached. The snarling feline hatefully growled at him at first, but eventually turned it into a scorning scoff. "And you think we're just going to..." He tried to mock and or taunt James. However, he seemingly didn't expect the human immediately pushing further with a forceful voice. "Yes, I think you are going to answer me," he exclaimed with a powerful tone that was just barely under a scream. "Because you attacked me without warning twice now. Because you scarred my partner for life. Because my sister is currently in a coma because of you. And because I have a goddamn right to know why the hell this is happening to the people I love. You've got a problem with me? Fine, I don't care. Get in line. But I swear to everything that still has a speck of worth left in this forsaken galaxy that you will tell me why my sister needs a machine to breathe for her, right now." As he spoke, he had inadvertently taken a single step in the feline's direction before stopping himself. His face burned with blood rushing into it from the intense focus, and he felt a wet film form around the corner of his eyes as he glared straight into the man. The feline stopped with his ears lifting just a bit higher, and his eyes widening by the tiniest margin at James's words. However, he still seemed to stubbornly refuse to answer. That was until... "It was my bad," the voice of the injured man on the bed rang out, causing both James and the feline locked in a staring contest with him to snap their heads around towards him. "Not your sister, but your girl. When she started to wind out of my grasp, I just freaked out. I just desperately tried to hold on to her. Didn't mean to tear her up." "You were just doing your job," the other feline protested the man's words with another disapproving snarl, before lifting his hand to aggressively point at James. "The one who freaked out was him." "We both did," the injured one disagreed. And although it was by no means enough to quell the still bloodthirsty parts of James's inner world, at least his reasonable mind was somewhat disarmed by the man's outright admittance of guilt. It showed a certain strength of character that he simply had to respect, no matter how much he disliked the person it came from. "Don't try to appease him after he did this to you," the healthy feline intensely demanded of his compatriot, leaning over him to stare directly down at his face. "He shouldn't be demanding anything of you. If anything, he should be groveling on his knees for your forgiveness. And if not, he should at least have the decency to bite it." A sharp glance was cast James's way, that was however interrupted when the stuttering voice of the man on the bed spoke up once again. Then so should we for his sister," he insisted right back up at his friend. And despite all the anger and hate that was still clearly filling the man, those words actually seemed to hit him much harder than anything that had been previously said, as he could do nothing more than break his gaze away so he wouldn't have to make eye contact for a moment. At the confirmation that he somehow caused this, a number of thoughts flashed through James's mind. However, ultimately, he could only think of one thing that may have had this effect in the long run. Hesitantly, he once again slowly looked down at his own arm. Nerve damage from prolonged exposure to very high voltage. Suddenly, he remembered the way that Sheeta's attacker had slumped down after James's electric grasp had pushed into him for, well, he didn't even really know how long. A quick shock would have been more than enough for his purposes. However, now James clearly remembered how he had just kept pushing, seeing nothing but red after the first drop of blood had been drawn. As strongly conflicting feelings clashed within his sleep-deprived mind, his mouth once again started to talk all on its own. I can make sure you get the right treatment for this, he said, without really wanting to do so. It just happened. I know you probably think it's permanent, but it can be fixed quite... Fixed? It immediately burst out of the healthy one of the two Miat, and this time, James flinched as the man actually threw his body against his restraints, his entire weight coming to a sudden halt when the train reached its maximum length and stopped his movement. Fixed? He repeated, his voice whipping up into a near frenzy while his free hand's claws dug into the bed sheet, as they simply needed to claw at something to let his frustration out. You think this can be fixed? Think you can just take this out of the world? Do your little science experiment and everything is fine again? The man slammed his hand down onto the bed, and every fibre of his being returned to full aggression as his hair stood up like quills in a porcupine. There is no fixing this, he growled deeply. The shock of the sudden outburst, as well as his already conflicted emotions, caused James to quickly fall into a defensive spiral, as the logical part of his brain took the wheel, as his emotions effectively cancelled each other out from his mind. Of course it can. Yes, repairing nerves is complex, but with the right treatment, he tried to explain. But obviously the feline was having none of it. There is no right treatment, he roared, and the sound of ripping fabric cut through the room as his claws dug a large piece out of the mattress. The only thing you can do now is make things worse. Haven't you done enough already? James took another step back as his brain got stuck for a moment, simply refusing to understand. Of course, there was a right treatment. It was quite simple, really. Why was that asshole being so adamant if the solution was just handed to him? After having so effectively demolished the mattress, the healthy feline's hand was grabbed by the shaky grasper of his compatriot, gently urging it to calm down with a soft grip. I... The painfully twitching feline muttered, clearly at a loss for words for a moment. I'm sorry for what happened to your sister, but I would like you to go now. He was looking away from James with his ears hanging down. The look on his face spoke of both honest guilt, but also a hint of very serious horror underneath. Once again, it just didn't compute to James. However, with the sudden demand being made, even if it was phrased politely, one of the emotional sighs in his head slowly began to win out. Because now they were making demands of him? He offered to help them with a problem that was clearly a huge burden in their life, even after everything they had done, and they wanted him to go away? His jaws clenched shut, and his grip got so firm that his knuckles pressed through his pale skin in white dots, while his fingers began to ache. With his lips barely parting from pressing together, in order to force out some words, he basically growled, "What the hell is your... James!" A forceful voice interrupted him, stopping him dead in his action. So far, Athena had quietly listened to the exchange after making his first remark. But now, the giant was looking at him with a stern gaze and had moved a step closer. His thoughts once again crashing like breaking waves, James stared back at the man for a moment. At first, anger won out once again. Who was that guy to give him orders? What? First he dragged him along to this place, and now he could just decide that it was over? Not like he cared about anything anyway. If he had done his damn job, none of this would have happened in the first place. He had more time than anyone else, and yet here he was, pretending like... In a gasp, James sucked in a deep breath as if surfacing from a deep dive. His lungs actually slightly ached from being pushed to their full capacity, but he still held the breath in for a long moment. Concentrating on it, he counted his own heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then, he very deliberately let the air out again in a gradual exhale. He would not allow himself to fall into another repeat of this shit. Not with so much on the line. "You're right," he said, once only a small rest of air remained in his lungs. Just enough to speak with. The other questions would have to wait. Let's go. Without another moment of hesitation, he walked out the door in a stiff march.